All right. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. We're happy to have you in our midst today as we're happy to have you join us today as we focus on one of our flagship programs that we are hosting, which is the Author Spotlight event. We are very privileged to have in our midst Dr. Hanna. Sorry if I don't pronounce that correctly. Who authored a very important book that I think is very relevant to our work today, which is on Islamists and the global order between resistance and recognition. Personally, I've enjoyed the perspective of this very unique literature in that it's given us a new dimension of moving beyond stereotyping religions, stereotyping individuals, boxing them in a particular frame. Whereas there are other aspects that we can explore, in understanding the motives for their actions, the motives for their identities, and the motives for their persons. I think this is what this text speaks to. And that is why we invited her to come and, discuss this very important text with us. And we have a very small audience here, but we're hoping that we're going to, put it out there on the YouTube channel for a lot of people to be able to, benefit from this very important work, even beyond our own generation, we are hoping. So to help us discuss this very important text, we have Dr. Seyi Ajayi, who is a research fellow of our center, and he's also a very versatile public servant in the US. We're glad. I hope it's not too early for you to join us. We also have Mr. Perez Arikhan, who is one of the research leads of our center. Just finished his graduate studies in Poland. We're glad that we have these two very these two very eminent scholars join us for this. So we're going to have a presentation from the author, then we have the discussions from our two discussants, then we'll open the floor for engagement from everyone. So without further ado, I will invite Dr. Pfeifer to please give us our own presentation. Thank you. You have the floor, please.
Thank you so much, dear Philip. It's really a great pleasure to be with you, at least digitally. I would have loved to do this in person, but let me also share that this is actually the first occasion that I have to talk about my book since I've published it. It came out last summer, and Philip was so kind as to contact me and invite me to give this talk and discuss it with you. And Philip, I'm even more grateful that you did this because with everything that's been going on in the so-called Middle East or West Asia, I have been, following these things academically, politically. And so I haven't had the chance to talk about this book. And at the same time, with everything that happened after the attacks by Hamas and other groups on military and civilians in Israel and the subsequent war and genocide in Gaza, I think some parts of this book have relevance in this context as well. And I think that some of the initial analyses that I try to give in this book about, what do we think, how do we conceptualize Islamists? We can see that in current debates right now, at least in Europe. So as you may have grasped from my book, it is really up against this very unifying, very simplistic notion of Islamists as terrorists. And at least in Germany, I can tell you that at the moment it's very hard to talk about this because, again, we have this equation fully back on the agenda. And my book tries to bring some nuance to this. So Philip, thank you for the introduction. I will now try to share my screen, if I may. And because I have prepared a PowerPoint, and please, if someone could let me know whether that works. Can you see it? Yes, okay,
Yes,
I see.
yes, it does. Yeah.
That's a good sign. All right. So, as I said in my introduction, for more than 2 decades, Western public and political discourse has nourished and reified the enemy image of Islamism. And my book tries to shed light on Islamists, to disaggregate the notion of Islamists, to make it, if you want to, like, if you will, more complicated, and specifically to engage with a question that the literature hasn't dealt with so much that far, which is, what is their take on international relations? What is their take on the global order? And I will proceed in the following way. So I will first introduce the topic and research question that the book tries to address. I will then present the argument that I'm trying to make in this book, and you can afterwards tell me whether convincingly so. I will then quickly dive into my 2 case studies, and then probably even more quickly try to sketch what we can learn from this book. But then I'm really looking forward to the 2 comments and the discussion that we're going to have. All right, so topic and question. I already said it. So we have a very unified, reified image of Islamism in Western public discourse. That's also true for Germany. And some have even claimed that the Islamists have come to replace communism as the specter that haunts the Western, or what is sometimes called or self-proclaimed liberal world. And this has led to an equation of, first, Islamism with terrorism, as we are currently witnessing again. Second, a leveling of a great variety of appearances of political Islam, from Salafi jihadism to Islamic conservatism. And that's also something that we've been seeing in the case of Gaza, where you would sometimes hear that Hamas is ISIS, or Hamas ISIS is what some people try to claim, that there is no difference. And third, we've also seen a tendency to view all Muslims as potential Islamists. So in some, Mavelli already warned in 2013, we have been seeing instances of a securitization of Islam as a whole. So basically, there is a very broad suspicion against Muslim communities, particularly in Europe and the West. So the academic debate is, of course, much more nuanced than this political discourse. And we have seen a lot of work being done on concepts of Islamism, on typologies of different Islamists. We have seen great studies from colleagues who studied Islamists in their particular respective domestic contexts. And we've also seen some work on the transnational networks between these groups, and also their historical emergence. However, I would say that in the context of international relations, there is a very strong focus on what I call, together with others, Salafi jihadist actors. And research on the latter's ideology and violent practices, including the rejectionist position toward the Western-dominated world order, is in fact abundant. So you will find a lot of studies on Al-Qaeda, on ISIS, and their rejectionist view and violent practice against this very order. But given that there is this focus of international relations and international security on this kind of order, what actually happened is that this state of research reinforced the political view that Islamists are simply enemies of the global order under liberal hegemony. And my book wants to show that this view is too simplistic. So I disaggregate this view of the Islamists as a unified group of actors to ask empirically first, what kind of relationship do actually existing actors, dubbed the Islamists, have with the global order under Western hegemony? And second, how do Islamists perceive of the world order, and how do they position themselves toward it, and with what purpose? So coming to my argument, this could be summarized that I think we should take Islamists as world political actors, but the focus is on political. So what I'm trying to do in this book is that I start with this image of a politics of rejection of the global order, as we have gained it from observing Salafi jihadist groups, to argue that this is an unwarranted reduction of a whole spectrum of theoretically possible and empirically observable positions Islamists hold vis-à-vis the global order. More specifically, the politics of rejection is only one of three possible forms Islamist encounters with the Western-dominated world order can take. And the other two, as you can see here, are what I call the politics of recognition and the politics of resistance. And I hope you will understand a bit more what I mean by that later on. So I understand these two as sort of ideal types, how political actors, and those could basically be any actors, can position themselves towards the world order. So this is not even specific for Islamist actors. We could also empirically investigate other actors. In order to correct the tendency to take Salafi jihadist actors as the archetype of Islamism, and thus to think of Islamist politics toward the Western world order in purely rejectionist terms, my book analyzes two actors that are also labeled Islamist, but are not part of the Salafi jihadist trend, and those are Tunisian Ennahda and Lebanese Hezbollah. I will talk about these cases more in a second, but beyond disaggregating Islamism, my book also shows that it is necessary to disaggregate something else, namely what is actually the Western world order. So that's also a term that we've been hearing as if, you know, there was a clear set of institutions or values or norms that we could name, and by that we know what the Western world order is. And I think that underestimates how much we actually see fighting within the West on what this world order is. So in my book, I take a discursive approach to world order. And I claim that it is produced through utterings by a variety of actors who are embedded in asymmetrical power relations. So I don't want to claim that the world order is only a discursive construction, because of course there is also a material side to it. But here I focus on the discourse of order, and on the actors that are part of and subjected to the global discursive structure, which is defined by differently powerful speaker positions. So actors may actually recognize and reproduce the existing order through their actions, but they may also oppose and challenge it, which would be the position of resistance, and they may, in fact, also reject and transgress it. So I think, you know, like the three types of engagement that I identify theoretically, empirically, of course, you will find mixtures of these practices. You will find that actors combine elements of resistance and recognition, and sometimes also reject certain parts of the world order. In order to detect these fine differences, it is necessary to also disaggregate what does world order mean. And and to specifically also show that Western world order discourse is in itself very fragmented and differentiated, and it only partly overlaps with what could be called liberal from the point of view of political theory. I think that's also important. Not all Western world order conceptions are in fact liberal, and of course there are liberal world order conceptions beyond the West. So what do I mean by disaggregation? I identify three discursive fields of global order, which revolve around three concepts. The first is sovereignty, and you see this in the table that I put in this slide. The second is legitimacy, and the third are the goals and values that an order should bring about, and this is what I call teloi here in this book. And these teloi are, interestingly, and you will see this in the empirical part of my presentation, connected to greater narratives about history. So I would argue that these three discursive fields are at the same time main discursive battlefields in the global discourse on world order. So sovereignty refers to the question of what are actually the entities that are ordered within this global order. Legitimacy refers to the principle according to which these elements should be ordered. And third, teloi refer to the normative aspirations that one can hope to realize with a certain order. So the table shows you the conceptions of sovereignty, legitimacy, and teloi that I found in Western world order discourse. We can talk about this a bit more in the discussion. For now, let me turn to the empirical cases, but I will there make a bit more clear what I actually mean by these conceptions. So let me come to the case studies. So in the empirical part of the book, I analyze how Islamist discourses, in the plural, relate to the main Western discourses on world order in the fields of sovereignty, legitimacy, and teloi. And the two cases covered in the book are Tunisian Ennahda, the largest Islamist actor in Tunisia that re-emerged as a successful party after the toppling of the Ben Ali regime in 2011. Before that, they were banned. And as you might know, members of Ennahda today are again imprisoned. The other case that I look at is Hezbollah, which used to be a very powerful Shiite party militia hybrid in Lebanon. And over the last couple of months, there was, as you know, at some point also, so there was an active war between Hezbollah and Israel, and last summer, Israel also invaded Lebanon and went against parts of Hezbollah, but also killed a lot of civilians in Lebanon. And from these, there is now the ceasefire, which is, you know, a very fragile one. But from these military interactions, Hezbollah has actually been significantly weakened, and we can talk about this later in the discussion. But it used to be considered one of the most potent non-state actors, certainly in the region, if not in the world. So for both countries, for Tunisia and Lebanon, the post-Arab uprising times were very troublesome. And let me highlight some aspects for Tunisia at first. I now realize, yes, that this is actually very small. You can also find this in my book, and I don't even want to go into all the details. Let me just summarize that in Tunisia, after the toppling of longtime dictator Ben Ali in January 2011, there was a very promising constitutional process by which Tunisia really worked on a new constitution This was done under several governments. So there were various changes in government, but for all of these governments, Ennahda was part of them. You can see that the constitution was actually adopted in January 2014. Tunisia held free national and then presidential elections in the same year. However, from the end of 2014 and then in particular in 2015 and 16 onwards, several terrorist attacks took place in Tunisia, and this actually brought about also a crisis in this country that came on top of an already existing economic crisis, but it also led to this new fresh constitution being suspended. And if you look into Tunisia today, you will see that this initial suspension was actually prolonged and served basically a re-autocratization of Tunisia after this, what looked like a very promising democratic trajectory. So for Ennahda, what's important is that they were in power in coalition governments for this whole period under investigation in my book. As for Lebanon, I think, so as you know, they were affected by the so-called Arab Spring or Arab uprisings, not so much in their own country, but by what was happening in the neighboring countries, especially the civil war that broke out in Syria. So this manifested first in a great wave of Syrian refugees that came to Lebanon in 2012. But then Hezbollah also began to fight in the Syrian civil war, and it decided to join forces with the Assad regime against what then became a whole dozens of armed groups within Syria. So it was a multi-party civil war, and Hezbollah claimed, as we will see later, that it was especially fighting Salafi jihadist actors, among them ISIS. But in fact, it had actually decided to join Assad in trying to suppress the Syrian people's uprising in 2012 and officially in 2013. So this was certainly among the most important contexts for Hezbollah. As you know, there were also various other wars that followed the Arab uprisings next to the Syrian civil war in Libya, which is not that important for Hezbollah, but importantly also in Yemen. Here also Hezbollah started to provide training to the Houthi militia in Yemen. And as you might know, they had been part for a longer time of the so-called axis of resistance, consisting of the Syrian and Iranian regime, and then a variety of non-state actors in the region. So the context of various instances of violence and to full-fledged wars was of significant importance to Hezbollah. At the same time, we should not forget that they were also part of the Lebanese government, coalition government, in this whole period. And that already shows you the sort of what is sometimes in the literature called the hybrid character of being a party and a militia. There would be much more to say on these two cases, but let me now move on to the analysis. So before I start, I want to say that it may at first sight seem a bit odd to compare Ennahda and Hezbollah in one book, because they are actually, at first glance, very different. They belong to different sects and different Islamist schools of thought. So Ennahda is a Sunni group and close to Muslim Brotherhood. Hezbollah is a Shiite Islamist actor. Another big difference is that Ennahda had been a non-violent actor for quite some time, whereas Hezbollah, as I said, is considered one of the strongest armed non-state actors in the region. So they also have very distinct organizational structures, and the domestic context in which they operate are also different. So why did I choose to look at them together in one book? Well, both, first of all, have been regarded as statist Islamists. That's a concept from Volpi and Stein. They are movements that have at some point started participating in domestic politics. So they have this orientation towards the state. They also share a hybrid quality typical for many Islamists, being both a movement and a party. And most importantly, as I've already emphasized when showing you the context, both of them have been met with skepticism and outright rejection by the Western world for being Islamist. But at the same time, both actors have been parts of their respective national governments. So even though there is this skepticism, they are actually confronted with this Western world order, and vice versa. Western politicians also had to deal with them. And that's, I think, a very interesting constellation, because there are not that many Islamists in power, at least in that region. So for observing what do they think about world order, this context is actually very helpful, because once Islamists are in government, they actually need to take position on international questions. They need to position themselves toward the global order. They do not necessarily have the, luxurious position of just, not saying anything about it. So I start with sovereignty. So I told you that I understand sovereignty as the question, what are the elements of global order that need to be ordered? There are four basic understandings in Western discourse of sovereignty, which would be absolute, popular, shared, and conditional sovereignty. And I found that for Ennahda, there's a strong focus on popular sovereignty, which is closely related to its self-understanding as a proponent of the Tunisian people's liberation, first from colonial rule, later from post-colonial dictatorship. And as we will see, Ennahda had also hoped that the people would basically liberate itself from terrorism eventually as well. Even though absolute sovereignty is also very important for Ennahda, in the sense that they tried to insist, especially during this Tunisian transition, on non-interference, so that no one from the outside would actually infringe upon the processes that were Tunisian processes. So there you find a notion of absolute sovereignty. But even though this is the case, they also have an understanding of shared sovereignty. So it's not that they ask for a very strong state, rather they tried to argue for decentralization within Tunisia. And there were also, which was also at the time, I think this idea got lost a bit, but at the time when I did interviews in Tunisia, there were also many proponents of a sort of regional integration in the Maghreb. For Hezbollah, the most important concept is absolute sovereignty. Why? because it is about the defense of Lebanon's territory and the protection of its people from outside interference. And this is invoked in particular in the context of Israeli threats to Lebanese sovereignty in the past, and as Hezbollah would argue, always looming on the horizon. Hezbollah also has a notion of popular sovereignty because, and there actually it got into quite some trouble because they were actually presenting themselves as huge supporters of the Arab uprisings in all the countries, claiming that finally they freed themselves from these dictators that had suppressed them for such a long time. But then, how could they intervene on the side of Assad? That was a big discursive problem for them. And I can tell you a bit more how they tried to solve that discursively later on. But they also have this notion of popular sovereignty, that it's actually the peoples of the region themselves that should decide on how they want to be governed. And finally, and I think most characteristically, Hezbollah also presents a notion of shared sovereignty, which is the so-called army-people resistance formula. What is meant by that? It suggests the combination of shared responsibility for security matters between, on the one hand, the formal state institutions, and on the other hand, the organized and popular resistance. So Hezbollah understands itself as resistance movement that, together with the state and other popular forms of resistance, should try to go up against Israeli assaults on the country, but also larger hegemonic schemes, as Hezbollah puts it, under US leadership. The next chapter in my book deals with legitimacy. So in Western discourse, you would find 4 discursive strands, or I identify 4 discursive strands. There might be more that I find most relevant in the Western discourse on legitimacy. There's individual and community-based, as well as deliberative and agonistic conceptions of legitimacy. And as I discuss in the theoretical part of my book, those conceptions of legitimacy are actually developed for the national context, but I try to show how these theories and ideological strands are actually also used to derive conceptions of legitimacy in a global order from them. And this sort of separation is also to be found in the 2 Islamist discourses that I look at. So you will find some differences made, especially in Hezbollah's discourse on the domestic context versus the international context. But let's go to Ennahda first. So Ennahda puts a heavy emphasis on consensus-based legitimacy, which contains some elements of deliberative ideals, but clearly exceeds them. So Ennahda basically argues that no important decision should be taken without an encompassing societal consensus. And you could see that in how much Ennahda actually tried to look for coalitions, tried to look for inclusion of as many parts of Tunisian society as possible, particularly in the constitutional process. And this idea of consensus seeking is combined with a very sophisticated political theoretical conceptualization of Islamic democracy as one version of community-based legitimacy. I cannot go into details here, but you could look that up in my book then. For the international order, Ennahda insists on a coexistence on equal footing. So that's very important for them. So to get rid of this strong power imbalances, to go for fair economic and political institutions, as well as a cessation of external support for dictators. And here you can again see the strong referencing of popular sovereignty. And finally, they also emphasize the importance of institutions, rights, and freedoms for especially the Tunisian democratic process. So in contrast, Hezbollah's legitimacy claims seem on the domestic level to be more pragmatic. So there it has a dialogue-oriented idea of legitimacy and combines it with a community-based argumentation. So what they basically claim is that every society has its own characteristics and needs to find a political system that fits this societal composition. And for Lebanon, they say, well, this is a society with many different religions and sects. So what is important for us is that we find a mode of dialogue and cooperation among sects and religions. So that's for the domestic level. However, for the international context, their focus is clearly on the question of legitimate and illegitimate violence. And I would also emphasize that for Hezbollah, I think the domestic context is something to be kept calm so that they actually have the resources, the capacities to go up against what they see as hegemonic plans for the region. So the international realm is even more important for their activities. So I already said that there are obvious contradictions and tangents in Hezbollah's discourse. On the one hand, they advocate standards of legitimate violence that are widely shared in the liberal international order. So you would find notions of what you could call very similar to the just war tradition in Western thought. But on the other hand, they continue to support the Assad regime, which used horrible forms of violence against civilians, and that also created tensions in Hezbollah's discourse. How could they support this kind of violence against fellow Arabs and Muslims? Finally, let's look at what I call teloi. So Ennahda actually has a utopian outlook, at least in this time. I'm sure this has now changed given that they are again subjected to state repression in a very strong way. But at the time they had this utopian view of actually being on a way from colonialism over post-colonial dictatorship to arriving at a state of democracy in a multipolar world where actually everyone takes seriously the sovereignty of others. And so that's their vision of utopian development. What should the world order realize? Well, sovereign states, equal nations living peacefully next to each other, ideally democracy. So that's the idea. And they also put that in parallel to their own development. So when Tunisians were subjected to colonialism, there was actually the reform movement that Ennahda takes as its sort of precedent, which developed into the Islamic movement that tried to propose an alternative to first colonial rule, but then post-colonial dictatorship. They then became an Islamist party, being part of a political system, and in a democracy, they wanted to become the party of Muslim Democrats. In contrast, Hezbollah has a dystopian view of the global order. So for Hezbollah, there is basically one basic conflict that always changes appearance but remains nonetheless the same conflict, and that's the conflict between the oppressors and the oppressed. So what you here see is also a figure taken from my book, and it is sort of the current, at the time, the period under investigation in my book, the current constellation of oppressors and oppressed, which can change historically, but always follows the same sort of scheme. It's an eternal struggle. This struggle in the 2010s takes the form of what Hezbollah calls a US-Israel-Saudi scheme. So they see that that there is actually an approach that there's an rapprochement between, on the one hand, US and Israel, and on the other hand, Saudis and the Gulf state, who try together to put in place their hegemonic schemes for the region in order to oppress the people of the region, Arabs, Palestinians, Yemenis, Bahrainis. And so what needs to be done, according to Hezbollah, is to resist against these schemes. And that's why there is support for the oppressed by the axis of resistance to which they and others belong. So their idea is really that this is a form of eternal struggle that cannot be overcome, but the task is to always recognize the changing appearances of this struggle. And I cannot elaborate on that for time reasons, but this already goes back to interpretations of very early Shiite struggles in early Islamic times. So there also you have this idea of oppressors and oppressed and resistance. So what to learn from this book? I'm already coming to an end, and I want to keep it short here. So I think my main takeaway would be that Islamists need to be taken seriously as world political actors rather than conceptualizing them primarily as religious, ideological, or rationalist, opportunistic. They are not, as some have suggested, in principle and a priori actors who show a moderate or compromising face until they are in power, just to reveal their true radical self. Nor are they in principle more irrational or prone to violence than other actors. But what do I mean by political? First, that Islamists have ideas about how the global order should be designed and how we should live together in this world, not only in the afterworld. That's also sometimes a cliche that Islamists only think about the afterworld. No, they have very concrete ideas about the here and now. Second, Islamists, like other actors, are deeply embedded in and aware of their world political context, to which they must in some way relate. So they need to legitimize their actions vis-a-vis different audiences, so their own constituency, but then also other actors that they interact with in the international realm. And finally, Islamists, like other actors, are context-bound, and therefore they also need to change and adapt their goals and strategies. So that also makes them political. They are actors who respond to different interests addressed to them by various others, and they must negotiate and strike compromises. They must sometimes act pragmatically rather than ideologically, and they must they must reconcile competing ambitions and interests. And I think if we think about Islamists in this way, and try to distinguish between different groups and try to zoom in on the details, and not take this idea of a radical rejectionist other, then there might actually be spaces for negotiation with these actors and cooperation. And with that, I would like to conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hanna, for your wonderful and elaborate presentation. Though our time is fast spent, but I would just like to give like a very brief summary of discussions, especially for those that joined us just later. So let me start from the ending part where you emphasize the fact that well, I don't know whether to call them Islamists, but so that I don't put them in the box, but actors within the Islamic religion are world political stakeholders beyond just being religious fanatics. And you spoke about the kind of politics that they engage in, categorized into that of rejection, recognition, and resistance. And you gave us the discursive bit of the world order that you were talking about to touch on sovereignty, which talks about how entities are ordered, legitimacy, the principles, guiding this kind of order, and tele, which I describe as the goal or the aspirations towards the end. You gave us a case study of another in Tunisia, which in character belongs in the Sunni sect of Islam, the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is part of the coalition government, and also, so it has a hybrid character and Shia, in terms of his orientation within the sect. Of course, he talked about his international dimension, which shows his involvement with Syria, the Syria civil war and support of Assad. I talked about how their structures are different locally, and how their local contexts are also different, and you went on to tell us about the sovereignty, categorizing it into popular sovereignty, absolute or shared, in each case, and how they manifested. Then you went on to tell us about legitimacy itself, which is individual, communal-based, or deliberative, and you emphasize in terms of the Hezbollah, the local and international dimension, which the international one especially talks about legitimate and illegitimate violence, and the Teloi, which I love a lot in terms of what the aspirations of these groups, are about, creating a multipolar world beyond the hegemonies that we have, and also the narrative of oppressor and oppressed, which inform the sort of dialectics that is internal, perhaps the oppressed are always being produced at each cycle to fight, against the oppressors. And you categorized also the distinction of the US, Israel axis, of influence, and also the Saudi and the Gulf states, and how these guys perpetuate, oppression. So I thank you for this very wonderful and elaborate presentation of this book, and I am sure that our audience will be interested in having further discussions on it. So let me hand over the platform to Dr. Seyi Ajayi to give us his own view of the book. Thank you. Dr. Ajayi.
Good morning from here, everyone. So, to be fair to Dr. Pfeifer, I will say that 1 hour is never going to be enough to have done justice to this work, because if someone has worked on I mean, it took about 10 years to produce this. I think it's a product of your doctoral dissertation. Is that the case? So definitely a very rich work. And so 1 hour, and even from my own comment, I hope to be able to do something more on this, because my comments are well noted, and hopefully I would be able to take it to another level of academic presentation. So, and I will say it's we can't really dwell into much of what should constitute a book review here again, because of the time factor. And be that as it may, I will point to a couple of things that I find very interesting, and also calling for more questions here. So I will note the fact that the author made clarity of arguments in presenting the roles played by these non-state actors or statist Islamists. And I like the fact of that disaggregating terms. First is the disaggregating of Islamists, rejecting that lumping of of groups together. So here we have the Salafi jihadis, we have the statist Islamists, so which Ananda in Tunisia and Hezbollah in Lebanon represent. So that disaggregation is very important, and I will speak a little bit to how we will find this to be important for international relations studies. So then the other one is the disaggregation of Western world order. So which is more of speaking to the fact that even what we have as Western world order is not even the only idea of world order that we have within Western intellectual tradition. Okay, so what we have now is just one-sided, as the author put it. So, which also means that there's also space for us to be able to look at what these groups are doing. So I'm not speaking of the other now, because now we have the Western world order and the other, so which the author critiques seriously, that we shouldn't have the idea of Western world order and the otherness of the Islamists, so which has created the problem of lumping together. So within this context too, I have one or two questions or issues I would want us to look at. So the book raises questions about whether statist Islamists should be ignored or engaged. And to be ignored or to be engaged, you want to look at what's happening in Syria right now and the role that HTS played with the overthrow of the al-Assad regime. So initially, the leader of HTS was rejected by the West. But now, if you see, there is that engagement that's taking place. So this part of where I see these books' importance, because at the end of the day, you can't totally reject these groups because they have agency, as we say in international relations. So they have agency. So the fact that they don't do things in the same way as we understand it doesn't mean that we cannot interact and understand where they're coming from. For one thing, they would never surrender their own agency. So, and this brings me to a recent situation. The current U.S. administration's envoy to the Middle East, deputy envoy, spoke to the leadership of the Lebanese government recently and drew a red line to say Hezbollah should not have a part in the government. So how realistic this will be is what I don't know, given how Hezbollah has structured itself and has presented itself. So, because Hezbollah is not just a political party, it's also a movement. Hezbollah has strongly infiltrated has been an active participant in the Lebanese politics. And Hezbollah's definition or understanding of sovereignty does not exclude its own role. So can the Lebanese government stand without Hezbollah? That's an important question. And we understand what's going on now so going back to the case of Tunisia, we see what's going on there. Gonachi is current, I don't know if it's been released now. Of late, I know he was imprisoned. So, and there's some kind of tag that's going on against Enanda. Yeah, Najali Hassan Najali was already was killed last year in Lebanon. So all of these things and these groups are never going to surrender their agency, because these are things that they have political understanding that are well structured within their own framework. So this leads us to serious. Then on a final note, for the relevance of this book for international relations studies. So the book also points to leads us to reflect on the tension between political realism and political liberalism. So what's the understanding of the state? So because like political realism says the state is the principal actor, the unitary actor. But what about the non-state actors? because in spite of the denials, they are active and their agency is well pronounced. So where do we place them? For example, the West rejected HTC's role, but when the West, when HTC overthrew Bashar al-Assad, the West, there was bounty on the leader of HTC, but now that's been removed. Now everybody is going to hold counsel with him or to talk with him and, hold meetings with him. So that kind of a situation leaves us with important questions in understanding of the state in international relations. So I will have to yield the floor to other speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful analysis, especially emphasis on the fact that agency cannot be ignored when it comes to international relations and politics, and the shifting dimensions of sovereignty based on the actors that is interpreting what all of these discursive contexts, what order, sovereignty, identity, religion, depending on their own perspective of it. And as you were talking, I was thinking of the Eastern Bloc and what kinds of relations, these groups can have with countries like China, like Russia, for instance, whether there's a chance, because, the EUs in China, for instance, have been repressed for a while, and you wouldn't be able to understand with the emergence of a multilateral order, BRICS and forming their own blocs and people becoming major, especially with the protectionist policies of far right, across Europe and also in the US. How are we going to, determine the agency? How do we even draw the lines, between negotiating? How do we negotiate, the trading of concessions? I don't know whether, it's a bit muddled up, but I'm saying, how do we trade concessions? How do we negotiate existence, along this path, which I think is something that is very critical that this book is calling our attention to. Mr. Arikhan, sorry for taking up some of the time. Please, I'll use the floor now.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I would also like to lend my voice to that of Dr. Ajayi when he spoke about appreciating what Professor Hanna has done. Reading through the book, it is very incisive. He brought out something that after reading it, I had the impression that, yes, I think we are having a different narrative for the first time, where we do not have to see realities just from one lens. Be that as it may, I would like to also state that the book tries to deconstruct the dichotomy between Islamism and Western world order, or their understanding of Western world order. Islamism, if I can use in simpler terms, is a political ideology that believes that Islam or Islamic principle of value should influence politics. Now, my point of departure is this: Islam has a political theology. And so to be able to understand Islam and Islamism, you have to know where they're coming from, which has been a rare understanding from the West. Because the Western, like she has also pointed that even the West, there are various understanding of Western, of the world order among the Western thinkers. Now, Islamism is quite different. And with this work, we saw that there was an insistence on Salafist jihadism as the banner boy, if I might use that term, as the banner boy of Islamism. And so that colored the impression, especially after the 9/11 attacks. The book tried to reconstruct this understanding and show that there is a plurality of concepts here, which we must understand and so be able to come into negotiation with. For the sake of time, I wanted to also say something about what we see in Syria today, but Dr. Ajayi has said something about that. Looking at it from the Nigeria context today, Salafi jihadism is what we see that is in most parts of the Sahel region, West Africa, and Nigeria. Now, because of the way it goes, because of their operation, their strategies, there is already a distorted vision, if I can use the word distorted in quotes, a distorted vision of Islamism itself. And now that is being propelled by the Western understanding of Islamism as a violent version, as different from what we saw from another, what is written in the book about another policy, the Muslim Brotherhood policy. Now, my question is, having read this book, I said the book is studying a book is a work in progress, because the more you read, I have to read and go back and read about the book again. The more you read, the more you get an understanding, and you look at it based on current events that are happening in the world. What propels this understanding of Islamism as a violent ideology that is that runs counter to the world order as the West understands it? Is it propelled by the Western media? And if we are going to have a negotiation, if we are going to have an understanding or a negotiation with this particular expressions, because there are various expressions, according to the world, there are various expressions of Islamism. It also has to go through the media. Now, who controls the media, and how would this be achieved? This is part of my question to Professor Hanna. The book is a beautiful work, and I think it's just like we are beginning an understanding that has to be opened more and more, just like an onion bulb, keep opening, understanding. So who controls the media, controls the narrative? So there will be a difficulty, because most of the media already have this understanding of Islamism as a violent ideology. That's one. Secondly, there is this understanding from many Western traditions that there should be a secularist division between religion and politics. And that runs counter to the ideology of Islamism, where religion and politics move hand in hand, they are intertwined. So that difficulty has been there. And that is part of what this book tries to expose and to show that, hey, these people, this is what they think, this is how they operate, and this is how we should understand them. Using the case study of Nada and Hezbollah. So this misunderstanding has led to what she termed a securitization of Islam. Islam became a political, a security problem. Islamism rather became a political problem. Now, how do we change this orientation? That's part of my question. Because having read the text, yes, there is room for negotiation to understand them, where she brought out the three possible forms of having where they have an encounter with the Western world order. We talk of the politics of rejection, the politics of recognition, the politics of resistance. Yes. Now, so how do we go about this? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful intervention and the posers that you've been throwing our way. I'm not attempting to answer any of the questions, but I also, as you were speaking, I just remembered the role of the influential countries. You know, when a lot of people are talking about renovating the UN Security Council, for instance. I mean, renovating may not be the right word, but I'm talking of restructuring. Yeah, that's like the popular common word that they use these days, restructuring the UNSC, you know, because there seems to be like foundational injustices in certain international structures that have been, that have imposed certain orders, you know, in terms of, and the problem I think we have is about the polarities of saying that this is right and this is wrong. You know, the different layers of intersections, you know, across different cultures have never been factored into place. And I'll end by saying I've been doing some work on this First World War, for instance, which was initially captioned as the Great War, you know, being fought in Europe, and how this became an umbrella vision of the world, you know, because of course you had colonies at the time and subjects. And I was also looking at the indigenous resistance that we had across West Africa, from Nigeria to the Gold Coast, in fact, criticizing the use of words like natives, you know, the treatments, you know, the use of colors, contribution. And so where people's primordial values have never been factored in place, they've always had the challenges, of compliance, if that's the right word to use, in all of these contexts. And this has always been enforced. In fact, my conclusion thus far is to say that the amalgamation of Nigeria in 1914, which had to do with bringing the Muslim North, together with the Christian South, is a very foundational problem, but which people have emphasized, but they've not really touched on the foundations of it. And one thing that I wanted to also point out is the legal structure, of this amalgamation. So there was a structure in place in southern Nigeria, which was, Christian, of course, the Lagos colony at the time, and they had this sort of judicial structure where the Supreme Court, was like the highest lawmaking or law decision or judgment giving body or whatever you want to regard it. But after the amalgamation, because of what has been happening in the North, perhaps because of the Islamic structure, the Supreme Court power was appropriated by the Governor General, such that whatever was decided in the Supreme Court was also subject to whatever decision the Governor General makes. And so it becomes clearer when you see a lot of meddling by the executive arm of government in power. And the North didn't have a problem with this. And so when people come out to say that there are different characters of these different axes of the country, it becomes clearer to say that perhaps there were different values that should have been negotiated, but were enforced at the time and are subsisting as problems that we are having as living together as a commune, at this particular point in time. So I don't want to take much of your time. I'll hand over the platform to Dr. Pfeifer to respond to the discussions thus far before we open the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for these very, very interesting comments and insights. And there were big questions asked, so I'm sure that I will not do justice to all of them, but I will also try not to speak too long, because I also have to apologize that I went over time. I didn't realize. I'm sorry. So I don't want to talk too long now, so we still have time for more questions. But maybe to go to Dr. Ajayi's questions first. So I think that you made a very good observation, that is that there are some practical necessities arising in different contexts to actually engage Islamist actors. We saw the skepticism towards HTS, and it reminded me a bit of the question of whether or not to engage the Taliban when they retook power. And I think your observation is very good to say, well, we cannot actually totally reject these groups. And you said because they will have agency and they will keep claiming agency. That's how I understood you. And so we need to deal with them. And I think that is a very important observation. They won't go away. You also referred to the Lebanese context, and I think I think it is a very fragile context in which any form of additional exterior interference can cause more problems. I think that this is particular moment in time with a very strong reconfiguration of power relations within Lebanon in disfavor of Hezbollah may actually be seen by Lebanese actors and, as you mentioned, by outside actors as a chance to finally get rid of Hezbollah. And I think that could really lead to extreme forms of violence up to a civil war. So I think, this is really a dangerous situation also for Lebanon. And I think that you are right in pointing out that these actors don't simply disappear just because you want them to disappear. So there is a very, practically, there are practical considerations to be made in how to deal with these actors. And then I also liked your comment because I think I've tried to sort of follow up. As you said, it took me very long to write this book. So there were several threads that I sort of continued in different other smaller or bigger research projects. And one is indeed what you said, the role of non-state actors in international politics, which I think is still underestimated, not only by realism, but also by basically many schools of thought. I think there's still very much not only a West centrism that you've also all of you have rightly pointed out, but also a state centrism. And I think the agency of non-state actors and also their international agency, so they act or inter or transnational agency, they have foreign policies, they engage in diplomacy, they sometimes interfere in third conflicts. All of these are behaviors that we know from states and associate with states, but that non-state actors also pursue. And so I think, and I've written a paper on this with Dr. Regine Schwab that I could also share with you, where we sort of try to challenge the strong binary in conflict studies between state and non-state actors. So I think that's also a point very well taken. And then moving on to Dr. Arikhan. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I pronounced your name correctly, so please correct me if I did wrongly. So I think you very also rightfully asked the question, where does this strong image of Islamists as reductionists come from? And you are right in pointing out the role of media. So I think it is very hard to change this narrative because so I try whenever I do appear in German media, I try to, differentiate and give knowledge that, it's not that easy. You need to distinguish between this and that. These are not the same phenomena and these things. So I think that this is already helpful. But to change the overall narrative, at least here in Germany, and I think maybe also more broadly in the West, and I mean, Philip, you were talking also about the Nigerian, not only you, like Dr. Arikhan also talked about the Nigerian context. So I would be interested in how it is there. But in the West, I feel that this narrative very strongly picks up colonial tropes, it picks up Orientalist tropes, and it picks up this idea of the dangerous East, which is a very present threat image that has been around. And Philip, you were talking about historical dimensions also, that has been around for quite a while in Europe. And I think that's why it's so hard to overcome, because it actually brings up old threat images that are combined with new ones. And so I find it very difficult to sort of make this narrative more complex and try to go up against it. And yeah, how to do these encounters. So I know this is I mean, that's the core question, right? How can you come to more cooperative forms? So I think the first thing that I also try to do is also to tell politicians, if they are interested in my opinion, well, you need to really look into the single case that you have in front of you. Look into the group. Don't make assumptions, but look into what they are saying and what they are doing. That's the first thing that you need to do. Don't base your assessment on cliches, but on real assessments of the particular case at hand. And I think, and then, see what are the options. So if I, for instance, think about Ananda, they have tried so hard to interact with Western politicians. They tried to sort of, recast the image that the West had of them. And the West was so irresponsive with, I think, or at least for Germany, I can say the argument, well, these are the Islamists. Once they are in power, they will be, suppressors, and they will go against democratic rights. I think there was no real empirical foundation for this claim. I think it was a cliche. At the same time, they had no problems whatsoever to cooperate with members of the former Ben Ali regime that had already proven that they would suppress the people and that they would go against democracy and rights. So I think there's really this irrational part of the fear of the Islamists. How to sort of solve that, I'm not really sure. And finally, yeah, I mean, maybe Philip, if I may come to one of your observations, which is this question of, what happens. How can you live together in a community when there are processes of amalgamation and, if I understood you correctly, also taking over institutions, hegemonizing institutions and these things. And I mean, I also don't have a solution for that, but it just reminded me that one thing that I found interesting in my study is that both actors under investigation have a very strong notion of, well, the political order that a society gets needs to fit this society. So, for instance, even Hezbollah would say, well, you cannot, in the past, they used to claim an Islamic state for Lebanon, but at some point they stopped doing that. And they said, well, in Lebanon, you have different religions living together, so you cannot establish an Islamic state. I think that's also what distinguishes them, among many other things, from Salafi jihadist groups who don't, they have this idea that this needs to be a unitary Islamic state. So there is a totalizing moment in that. You don't have that for Hezbollah, and for Ennahda, same thing. They would say, well, this is a primarily Muslim society, so Islam should play a role in the political order. But then we need to be inclusive. We need to base our constitution on consensus of all parts of society. And I think that's actually something to reflect on, and to maybe even to sort of learn from as an idea, to think that, a political system needs to fit the composition of society.
Yeah, thank you very much for your elaborate responses as usual. So we'd like to open the floor for anyone. Please, does anyone in the house have any comment or questions so that we can quickly take them? Our time is fast spent. Otherwise, I have like some 2-3 questions I want to put forward. Is there anyone that wants to just make a comment? All right, so I will wait. Let me just chip in. So I'm looking at the intra-Islamic context of the Sunni and the Shia, and I can take Yemen, as an example of it, the Saudi axis and the Houthi, dominated axis, which also has to do with the history of colonialism, in these countries. So beyond engagement outside of people of different faiths, how do those kinds of challenges, between these professing different strands of Islam affect the processes of accepting certain kinds or negotiating world orders, if I may use it, based on your analysis, and how have they been able to manage, or how does this distort the vision of the teloi of these groups, that you've described? Then the second one is on anti-Semitism, which has to do with the identity of Israel, or the identity of an Israeli being linked to the identity of the state, and how the historical challenge, of course, of the Holocaust, like we all are aware, has led to challenges of creating an equitable world order, which from whichever perspective you are looking at it, creates a kind of complications when you look at what happened in Gaza, for instance. So how does these negotiations of, the world orders by these different groups, Hamas, and their October 7 attacks, for instance, what sort of influence, came up to create some of these challenges? But most importantly, the reactions that followed these attacks, especially with what Israel did, how do those little strands and complications of understanding the normative values of different contexts affect the perspective or the lens from which we process some of these challenges? So what I'm saying is that in today's world, how can we define anti-Semitism while trying to be able to hold, Israel also accountable for some of his actions. And it's not really very different, because it's because of Hamas that all of this may have happened. And from what you said, that we should not just categorize these people as being irrational in terms of their approaches. What sort of global political order influence some of these ideologies and actions? And how can we manage them appropriately to create justice, for each of the parties? We are happy that there's a ceasefire going on, and, things are improving in that space. So let me just stop with those two. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, for these questions. These are very big questions to end with. Let me address the first one first. So where you are interested in how does intra-Islamic plurality affect world order conceptions, but then also, if I understood you how correctly, you were also asking for the challenges that this poses. So I think for my case studies, I think it's very interesting to see that so the Islamic traditions that these actors come from do matter. But I would say more as a sort of cultural form of shaping expressions of order. That now sounds a bit cryptic, but let me give you examples. So, for instance, Ennahda's ideas of Islamic democracy, they are very much shaped by the political thought of Rashid al-Ghanouchi, their president. And here I think that, and I'm not at all an expert on that, so I would have to refer you to historians of political thought and political theorists. But I think it is interesting that Rashid al-Ghanouchi has a very elaborate political theory of Islamic democracy that builds on various traditions in Islamic political thought. And in that sense, the ideas of legitimacy that Ennahda tried to also institute for Tunisia have their root in that. And so in a mediated form of, interpretation of Islamic values. So in my book, you will find a chapter on this, on Islamic democracy and what the ideas are. And there are many interesting aspects to look at. But what I found particularly interesting is that you also find some kind of convergence there, where sort of Ghanouchi tries to tell a story of, and that's also something that we find in Western thought, to tell a story of Western critical thought, how basically the story of secularism, and I don't know, someone mentioned it earlier, so this idea of separation of religion and politics is a very European story that is then universalized to other contexts. And that's a criticism that has been articulated in Western discourse as well. And he then tries again to make the case that this cannot be universalized in this way, and that actually, and he there talks a lot about French laïcité. He then also says, well, it is not even a neutrality of the state that is that we see, but it is actually a hostility of the state towards religion. And he then argues that this cannot be the way for Muslim society. So again, the focus is on what society do you have in front of you, and then what is the good fit of a political system for that society. For Hezbollah, you would find, for instance, and I said that in my presentation, that the really religious parts come in very much in the interpretation of the conflicts that we are seeing in this world. You will find a lot of references to Shiite figures from history that would sort of serve as how could you say, metaphors or points of comparison that help us decipher what's going on at the moment. And that's where their Shiite tradition comes in. But again, it doesn't come in, very, much in your face, but more subtly in the cultural form of what do they propose as order. So it's an indirect way. And I think that we've seen a lot of, we've seen a lot of talk about sectarian conflicts in the region, and we have seen a lot of sectarian tensions. But I think there I would go with colleagues like Hashemi and Postel, who have this notion of the sectarianization of conflicts, so that actually there are drivers and actors who have an interest in interpreting ongoing political conflicts as sectarian conflicts in order to mobilize. And I find it very interesting that here, for instance, Hezbollah is really trying to go up against that. And I now see that Ehinon Perez Arikhan is already leaving, because I talked again very long. I'm sorry, and I want to thank you again for your comments. We're already at the end of time, so very quickly on your last question, I can't answer this quickly, but I think that because it's a very complex question. You also asked about historical dimensions of this, and if only I knew how to solve this current situation, that would, be so great. But I don't know how to solve it. But I think that a core distinction should be made and be upheld. So at least in Germany, we now see a great tendency to conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of the government or the state of Israel. And those phenomena are not the same. We can hold a government and a state accountable for crimes under international law, irrespective of what kind of identity this state claims to have. International law is, is valid for all the states, irrespective of the identity they claim. And one thing does not have anything to do with the other. So if there are war crimes committed, then we have certain mechanisms of pursuing them. We also have certain policies of reacting to them. And I think it is very important to keep these two things apart, like to judge the behavior and the commitment of a state to international law is one question. The question if there is identity-based hatred or crimes against humans, individuals, because of their identity is a completely separate question, and I would keep those two apart, and I think it's very important to do that in this current conflict as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hanna Pfeifer, for your very wonderful and exhaustive, deliberations on this very topical issue that is very relevant in our work today. I pasted in the chat before that the book is readily available online, so you can get it and read it if you're interested in taking this further. But I would also like to say on your first intervention that as you were speaking of Ghanouchi's kind of democratic politics, I was remembering Gaddafi's Jamahiriya, his critique of representative democracy, and I was advocating for a participatory model, which is very valid, even if you look at the kind of politics that the US is playing today. So whether before the build-up to the elections and inauguration, or what has been happening with the executive orders beyond that. So it's important to reevaluate even these kinds of systems that have been regarded as canons over the years, whether we actually have democracy whether we are gaining, we have the gains of democracy as we should, have it in the world today. So we are very grateful. Thank you very much for your scholarship, the depth of work, taking time to write this book for us, which I know that posterity is going to judge you right on it, because these are very good perspectives for understanding, some of the critical issues in our world today. We also thank Dr. Seyi Ajayi, who left us, and also Mr. Perez Arikhan for helping us to dissect some very important aspects of the book. To those who are with us till this very moment, we thank you very much for constantly supporting, our work and contributing to it. And we hope that we can keep this community together. I'll make the lecture available on YouTube as usual, after the lecture, so that other people can have access to this wonderful contribution to knowledge. So without further ado, we wish to thank everyone and wish you the very best for the rest of the day, whatever time period you are in the world. So thank you very much, and hope we can keep the conversation going on this. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the great conversation. Thank you to all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.